Welcome to Sleepy SpongeBob!
The ocean keeps secrets the way the sky holds stars, endless, quiet, and shimmering just out of reach. Most creatures never notice. They move through their days chasing food, chasing shelter, chasing whatever light falls closest to them. But there was one, long ago, who noticed the whispers beneath the surface, the faint hum in the dark water. His name was SpongeBob, though the name feels far too simple for what he carried inside. When you picture him, perhaps you imagine the laughter, the skipping steps, the crackle of happiness spilling out like bubbles. That was true. It was all true. But hidden beneath that laughter, like the cool sand beneath the sunlit beach, there was something gentler, quieter, and strangely heavy. Even as a child, he sensed it. Though he couldn't have put words to it, it was just a knowing, a sense that joy was not the whole story, that every giggle came with a shadow folded neatly behind it. It began with dreams. He would drift to sleep in his little bed inside the pineapple house, the soft hum of the sea cradling him. And sometimes, in those deep hours when the currents were still, he dreamed of places he didn't understand. Vast halls with coral pillars, caverns filled with echoes, shadows that stretched across sand where no creature lived. And in those dreams he felt both afraid and comforted, as if the darkness was not there to harm him, but to remind him he never spoke of it, not to Patrick, not to his parents, not even to Gary, who blinked with eyes that seemed to know more than he could say. Instead, he carried it quietly, like a seashell pressed to the heart. Some mornings, when the sun spilled golden through the sea and jellyfish danced like lanterns, he forgot the dreams. But at night, they always returned, soft as lullabies, heavy as tides. As a boy, SpongeBob was different from the others, not in the obvious ways people laughed about, not just the boundless cheer, not just the bubbling voice. He was different in the way he noticed things. He could sit still longer than most expected, just watching the way seagrass swayed or how tiny fish curved around a rock. He laughed louder than the rest, yes, but he also listened more deeply. Sometimes, in the middle of someone's sentence, he'd tilt his head and hear what wasn't being said. The pause, the sigh beneath the words. He didn't always understand, but he felt it, and that mattered more. There was one evening in particular, back when he was still small enough to sit cross-legged on the floor without his knees complaining. The sky above the water had turned a dusky lavender, and the town of Bikini Bottom was quieting. SpongeBob sat by his window, tracing circles in the glass with one finger, watching the jellyfish glow faintly in the distance. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt a lump in his throat, though nothing had happened to cause it. It was as if the ocean itself was sighing, and his little body was simply echoing the sound. His grandmother once told him that sponges carried the sea inside them in ways no one else did. "You hold more than water, dear," she whispered one night as she tucked him in. "You hold feelings. That's why you swell with joy. That's why you sometimes sink with silence." SpongeBob didn't fully understand, but he remembered. He remembered the softness in her voice and the way she smoothed his blanket like she was smoothing the whole world. It was then that he began to realize. Maybe the darkness in his dreams was not an enemy. Maybe it was simply another part of the sea inside him, another tide moving in rhythm. But childhood has a way of brushing away such thoughts. Days at boating school filled with nervous laughter. Hours spent chasing jellyfish with Patrick, their giggles spilling into the open fields. Ice cream dripping down his hands in the heat of summer currents. These were enough to keep the shadows at bay. For a while at least, still the ocean never lets go of its secrets so easily. And one night, not long after, he woke to the sound of silence. It wasn't the usual kind, the soft hush of the sea, but a silence that felt awake, alert, watching, SpongeBob sat up in bed, his eyes adjusting to the faint glow from his night lamp. The room was the same, Gary coiled gently in his shell, the walls lined with little trinkets, and yet it felt different, heavy, like a weight pressing down on the very water around him. He whispered, "Hello?" His voice was small, swallowed quickly by the room. There was no answer, and yet he felt something stir inside. Not fear, not really, more like recognition, as if the silence itself was answering in its own way. "I'm here. I've always been here." In the morning, the feeling faded, as it always did. The sun rose, he stretched, he sang as he cooked. Patrick knocked on the door, and soon they were running through town, arms flailing, laughter tumbling from their mouths. But even then, somewhere beneath it all, SpongeBob remembered the silence. He carried it quietly, tucked away like a secret note no one else could read. Perhaps this was the beginning of what others might someday call his dark side. But SpongeBob never saw it that way. To him, it was simply part of being alive, the soft underside of joy, the shadow that gave shape to the light. Years later, when people thought only of his boundless cheer, they would never guess that he had been listening all along, listening to the whispers in dreams, listening to the sighs no one else noticed, listening to the silence that lived beneath the sea, and in that silence he would come to find not just fear, but wisdom, love, and the strange tenderness of knowing that joy is only real when it makes space for sadness, too. For now, though, he was still a child, still just a sponge with dreams too big for his little bed, still learning that every laugh was stitched with quiet, still carrying the secret seashell of his heart. And though he did not yet know it, this was only the first step in a long, gentle journey, a journey that would teach him how even the brightest smile needs the balance of shadow. The sea has a way of folding one day into the next, until time itself feels like a soft current drifting endlessly forward. For SpongeBob, those early days of laughter and strange dreams bled gently into one another, each moment carrying the weight of the last. The shadows he felt at night, the quiet voice that seemed to hum in the silence, did not disappear. They waited patiently, following him like a tide that ebbs and flows but never truly leaves. He carried them into his mornings without even realizing it. When he walked to boating school with a hopeful smile stretched across his face, when he clutched his pencil too tightly during tests he would never quite pass, the shadows were there, whispering at the edges of his awareness. They were not loud, not frightening, only persistent. Sometimes he felt them in the pauses between his laughter, or in the hush that fell after a joke when his friends were still catching their breath. In those little silences he felt the same recognition he'd felt that night in his bedroom. "I'm here. I've always been here." SpongeBob never mentioned it aloud. How could he? Joy was his language, and he spoke it fluently. He was the one who brought sunshine into rooms, who turned dull days into carnival hours. To speak of shadows felt like betraying the very gift that made him who he was, and yet part of him wondered if his gift came not despite the shadows, but because of them. Perhaps he could laugh so loudly because he had heard silence so deeply. Patrick, of course, noticed something, though not in words. He had a way of sensing SpongeBob's moods without fully understanding them. One afternoon, as they lay flat on their backs in jellyfish fields, staring up at the swirls of ocean light, Patrick turned his round head toward his best friend and said, "You're really quiet today." SpongeBob blinked, surprised. "I am?" Patrick nodded, thoughtful in his own clumsy way. "Yeah, your eyes look like they're listening." SpongeBob laughed softly, but the words stayed with him. Listening. That was what it felt like he was always listening to something beyond the noise of the day. Even when the world was bright and busy, a part of him leaned toward the quiet. He didn't tell Patrick this, but he reached out and held his friend's hand for a moment, and Patrick smiled like that was all the answer he needed. At home, the shadows showed themselves most clearly. His pineapple house, cheerful on the outside, had corners that grew still at night. Sometimes, when Gary's tiny snores filled the silence, SpongeBob sat on the edge of his bed and thought about the words his grandmother had whispered. "You hold more than water. You hold feelings." He wondered if that was why his chest sometimes felt so heavy, even when his mouth was full of laughter. It was during one of those nights that he discovered something important. He had been sketching absent-mindedly in a notebook, a jellyfish, a spatula, the outline of Patrick's head, when his pencil slipped, leaving a streak of shadow across the page. Instead of erasing it, he leaned closer. The mark reminded him of the dream places he had visited, the cavernous halls, the sweeping shadows. And as he filled in the shapes, slowly, carefully, he realized something he had never considered. The darkness he dreamed of was not empty. It was full of shapes and meanings waiting to be seen. That night, he didn't feel afraid of the silence in his room. For the first time, he felt curious. What if the shadows weren't here to frighten him, but to teach him? The next morning, life went on as usual. SpongeBob hummed as he flipped Krabby Patties at the Krusty Krab, beaming at each customer as though they were an old friend. Mr. Krabs barked orders. Squidward sighed in despair, and the rhythm of the day rolled on like waves. But underneath the routine, SpongeBob carried a quiet new awareness that the shadows were part of his story, whether or not anyone else could see them. He began to notice things differently. When Squidward's clarinet drifted through the thin walls of their homes, SpongeBob heard not just the notes, but the longing in them, the ache of someone wishing for a life they didn't have. When Mr. Krabs spoke gruffly about money, SpongeBob heard the fear beneath it, the desperation to hold on to something before it slipped away. Even Patrick, in all his simple joys, carried moments of sadness that revealed themselves in quick glances, in the way his voice softened when he said goodbye at the end of the day. SpongeBob didn't always know what to do with what he felt. Sometimes he made jokes too quickly, filling the silence before it could settle. Sometimes he grew quiet, letting the moment pass without speaking. But more often than not, he simply stayed beside the people he cared about, letting them know, without words, that he understood, or at least that he was trying to. There was one evening when Squidward, exhausted after a long day, dropped his clarinet outside his house and muttered something bitter about wasted time. SpongeBob, standing nearby with a spatula still tucked into his pocket, bent down to pick it up. He didn't say anything clever. He didn't tell Squidward to cheer up. He just handed the clarinet back gently and said, "It's a nice night, isn't it?" Squidward blinked, startled, then grumbled something under his breath. But later, long after SpongeBob had gone inside, Squidward sat by his window and played a song softer than any he had played before. These moments stayed with SpongeBob. They reminded him that shadows were not always dark. They were simply quiet spaces waiting for someone to notice them. He began to wonder if perhaps his laughter wasn't just about joy. Perhaps it was also about filling those spaces with warmth. Perhaps that was why he had been given the strange gift of carrying both light and shadow inside. Still, he kept most of these thoughts to himself. He was, after all, just SpongeBob, cheerful fry cook, loyal friend, relentless optimist. No one needed to know about the dreams or the heaviness that sometimes swelled inside his chest. It was enough to live his days the way he always had, with laughter and kindness, while letting the shadows quietly shape him from within. But deep down, he sensed that the sea was not finished with him yet. The dreams would return, the silences would grow deeper, and the whispers would ask more of him than he yet understood. For now, though, he let the tide carry him gently forward, as childhood continued its steady drift towards something larger. And in the quiet spaces between laughter, SpongeBob listened, always listening. The days began to fold into one another, each filled with the hum of ordinary routines and the subtle pull of something deeper. SpongeBob laughed as he always did, moving through life with a brightness that lit up every corner he entered. But now there was a quiet awareness beneath it all. The shadows he had learned to notice, the silent weight in the pauses, the hidden meanings in sighs followed him gently, as if waiting for him to understand more. Patrick remained his anchor, a constant presence of warmth and simplicity. Their friendship was like a current he could always drift back into, no matter how far his thoughts wandered. One evening they sat together on a rock near the edge of jellyfish fields, watching the glowing creatures drift through the water like slow-moving stars. Patrick spoke little, only humming a tuneless melody while he kicked his legs in the sand. It was enough. SpongeBob felt, in that silence, a comfort he couldn't find anywhere else. Patrick didn't need explanations. He simply accepted SpongeBob's quiet mood as easily as he accepted his laughter. But acceptance didn't erase the questions. SpongeBob began to notice something new. The way his laughter sometimes rang hollow in his own ears, the way he caught himself wondering if others really felt it the same way he did. Was joy something he gave away, or was it something he clung to, desperate to keep from slipping into the silence that haunted his nights? He didn't have an answer, but the wondering itself was a sign that something within him was changing. The shadows of his dreams deepened. One night he found himself walking through an endless hall of coral pillars, their surfaces dark and gleaming. He felt small, almost swallowed by the vastness around him, yet the silence was not frightening. It was patient. He moved slowly, his footsteps echoing faintly, until he reached a pool of still water at the center. When he leaned over, expecting to see his own reflection, he found only darkness stretching endlessly below. And in that darkness he thought he heard a voice, not speaking, but humming, like a lullaby, without words. When he woke, the sound lingered, softer than memory, yet impossible to forget. The next day at the Krusty Krab, his movements felt slower, almost reverent, as though he was still carrying the weight of the dream. Customers came and went. Mr. Krabs shouted about money. Squidward rolled his eyes, but SpongeBob flipped each patty with unusual care, as though each one mattered more than usual. Squidward noticed, though he pretended not to. He glanced at SpongeBob now and then, and for a brief moment his annoyance softened into something almost like curiosity. SpongeBob, catching the glance, only smiled faintly, sensing that behind Squidward's sharp words and heavy sighs there was a loneliness not so different from his own. That evening, SpongeBob returned home more tired than usual. Gary blinked at him with slow patience, and SpongeBob knelt down, stroking his shell absently. "Do you ever feel like you're carrying something you don't understand?" he whispered, though he didn't expect an answer. Gary purred softly, and SpongeBob smiled. Maybe that was the answer. Some things didn't need to be solved, only carried. It was around this time that SpongeBob's bond with Squidward began to shift, almost imperceptibly. Squidward had always been the foil to his cheer, dismissing his energy, groaning at his constant invitations. Yet SpongeBob, with his new awareness, began to hear the music in Squidward's bitterness, the low, mournful notes of someone who longed to be understood. One night, after hearing the clarinet drift through the walls again, SpongeBob found himself sitting quietly by his window, listening. The melody was clumsy, uneven, but full of longing. He imagined Squidward's hands trembling slightly as he played, pouring into the instrument all the words he could never speak aloud. SpongeBob closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him, feeling the weight of another's shadow pressing gently against his own. The next day, he greeted Squidward differently. He didn't try to cheer him with silly jokes or exaggerated antics. He simply said, "Your music sounded real last night." Squidward blinked, startled, before snapping back with his usual sarcasm. But his face betrayed a flicker of surprise, even a trace of relief. SpongeBob didn't press further. He had learned that sometimes the kindest thing was to notice without demanding more. Patrick, too, continued to be part of this quiet journey, though in his own way. His simplicity was a gift. He asked questions that seemed foolish but carried unexpected weight. One afternoon, as they sat together eating ice cream cones that melted too quickly in the warm current, Patrick suddenly asked, "Do you think laughter ever gets tired?" SpongeBob laughed at first, thinking it was just another one of Patrick's odd remarks. But the question lingered long after the ice cream was gone. Could joy itself grow weary? Was that what he felt in those quiet moments, when his chest grew heavy, when his smile faltered in the dark? He didn't answer Patrick then, but the question stayed with him, weaving itself into his dreams and his waking thoughts. It made him wonder if laughter was not endless after all, but something fragile, something that needed care, just like any other living thing. Perhaps it wasn't about laughing forever, but about knowing when to rest, when to listen, when to sit quietly beside a friend without saying a word. The days continued, steady as the tides, but SpongeBob was no longer the same. His laughter still rang out, but beneath it was a softness, a quiet strength shaped by shadows. He didn't yet know where it would lead him, only that the ocean had more to teach. Each dream, each silence, each question felt like a step on a path he couldn't quite see, but felt drawn to follow, and so with each passing night, as the waves curled softly against the edges of his pineapple home, and the hum of the sea deepened into silence, SpongeBob lay awake just a little longer. He listened for the unseen voice, for the lullaby without words, for the shadows that promised not fear, but understanding. In those moments, he realized something simple but profound. Joy was not the absence of darkness. It was the light that learned to shine alongside it. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the truest gift he carried. SpongeBob found himself dwelling on Patrick's question long after the ice cream had melted away. Could laughter ever grow tired? The thought slipped into his mind in the quiet hours, returning again and again like the tide. He noticed it most when the laughter slowed, when the Krusty Krab emptied out at the end of the day, or when Patrick drifted off to sleep mid-conversation, leaving SpongeBob alone with the hush of the sea. He would feel the weariness in his smile, as though joy itself were a lantern that needed tending, its flame flickering softer when the night grew long. Yet even in those heavy moments, SpongeBob carried something else inside him, an instinct, a pull toward kindness. It was as if the same shadows that pressed on his heart also sharpened his awareness of others. He noticed things that others missed. The way customers at the Krusty Krab would pause for a second too long before ordering, carrying unspoken worries behind their polite words. The way Squidward's hands sometimes trembled when he held his tray, his sighs deeper than annoyance could explain. The way Mr. Krabs, for all his bluster, clutched his money not with greed but with fear, as though letting go of a single coin might unravel the fragile world he had built for himself. SpongeBob didn't have the answers to any of it. He didn't know how to solve loneliness or fear or longing, but he had a way of standing beside people in their shadows, even if they never noticed. When Squidward snapped, SpongeBob didn't always push back with louder joy. Sometimes he simply stayed. When Mr. Krabs fretted over lost profits, SpongeBob listened more than he spoke. And when Patrick asked questions that seemed too simple to matter, SpongeBob gave them space to echo in his mind, letting them shape him quietly. One evening, the Krusty Krab had closed early. The streets of Bikini Bottom were nearly empty, and the sea glowed faintly with the soft shimmer of plankton. SpongeBob lingered by the restaurant, wiping down a table that no one would see until morning. Squidward was still there, slumped at the counter, staring into nothing. For once his clarinet wasn't in his hands. He looked smaller than usual, his bitterness dulled into something quieter. SpongeBob wanted to say something cheerful, something that might lift the moment, But instead he just sat down a few stools away and let the silence hold them. After a long pause, he said softly, "You work hard, Squidward."
"Even when no one says it, I see it," Squidward scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual sharpness. "And what good does it do me?"
SpongeBob tilted his head, thoughtful. "Maybe it doesn't have to do good.
"Maybe it just—"
Means you matter." The words slipped out without plan, surprising even SpongeBob. Squidward froze, his eyes darting toward him for just a moment before he turned away. He muttered something SpongeBob couldn't quite hear, then stood and left. But that night, as SpongeBob walked home, he thought he heard faint music drifting through the water, softer and steadier than before. The small moments became like threads, weaving together a quiet truth. SpongeBob began to understand that kindness was not always loud. Sometimes it was a gentle acknowledgement, a patient silence, a steady presence. It didn't fix things, but it carried them, and carrying was its own kind of gift. At home, these thoughts grew heavier. He would lie awake, staring at the dim glow of his night lamp, and wonder if this was why the shadows had always followed him, not to frighten him, but to teach him, to remind him that laughter and kindness were not separate from sadness, but born out of it, shaped by it. Perhaps he was not meant to outrun the silence, but to learn how to live inside it and still choose to smile. Patrick, in his innocence, often nudged him closer to these realizations without knowing it. One afternoon, they were building sandcastles near Goo Lagoon, stacking towers too high until they toppled in the waves. Patrick, brushing sand off his belly, looked at SpongeBob and said, "You always make me feel like it's okay to be me."
"Even when I don't get things right." SpongeBob froze, the simple words sinking into him.
He smiled gently, feeling warmth rise in his chest, but also a pang of something deeper. Was that what his laughter did? Was that his purpose? Not just to be happy himself, but to remind others they were enough? He didn't answer Patrick with words. Instead, he rebuilt the toppled tower beside him, slowly, carefully, letting the silence carry the gratitude he didn't know how to express. Still, questions lingered. If his laughter was a gift, was it also a responsibility? Could joy become a burden when others leaned on it too much? These thoughts tugged at him in quiet hours, like currents beneath the calm surface of the sea. He didn't speak of them to anyone, but he carried them everywhere, tucked behind his wide smile. And yet, despite the heaviness, there was a peace in these discoveries. SpongeBob no longer feared the shadows as he once did. They were not strangers now. They were companions, shaping his days in ways he barely understood. When he laughed, he knew it was real, not because it erased the silence, but because it had grown alongside it. On nights when the dreams returned, the endless halls, the dark pools, the humming voice, he leaned into them with curiosity rather than fear. He would wake with the echoes still ringing, and instead of pushing them away, he carried them with him into the morning. Each dream felt like a step forward, though toward what he could not yet see. And so his journey unfolded quietly, without great fanfare or sudden turns. Day by day, kindness deepened, laughter softened, shadows grew familiar. The world around him remained the same: friends, work, the rhythm of simple days, but inside, SpongeBob was slowly learning that to truly bring light, one must first understand the dark. And though he did not yet know it, this gentle balance between joy and shadow would one day shape not only his own story, but the stories of everyone who shared the waters beside him. The days in Bikini Bottom began to take on a rhythm that felt both familiar and strange. SpongeBob moved through them with the same exuberance everyone expected, yet beneath the laughter and the busy hands flipping patties, something deeper had begun to stir. The shadows he had carried since childhood no longer pressed heavily on him. Instead, they lingered at the edges, shaping his awareness, giving him a kind of quiet clarity. He noticed subtleties in the currents, in the way sunlight refracted through the water, in the small hesitations of those around him. One morning, SpongeBob awoke to a dream that felt heavier than usual. He had been walking through a field of glowing jellyfish, each pulsating softly, casting light across a darkened sea floor. But this time the field seemed endless, stretching farther than any part of jellyfish fields he had ever known. The jellyfish moved in patterns he did not recognize, forming shapes that seemed almost deliberate, almost like a language. And in the midst of it all he felt a pull, not frightening, not urgent, but insistent, a gentle tug at the edges of his mind. He awoke with a start, sunlight filtering through the pineapple's windows, and for a moment the memory of the dream lingered so vividly that he could feel the pulse of the jellyfish beneath his fingertips. Gary blinked up at him, and SpongeBob smiled faintly, stroking the snail's shell as if sharing a secret. The day ahead seemed ordinary enough, yet he carried the sense that something had shifted. The world, once simply bright and bustling, now held a hidden depth waiting to be explored. At the Krusty Krab, SpongeBob found himself noticing patterns he had never seen before. The way the customers moved, the rhythms of the waves outside, even the way his spatula struck the patties, all seemed imbued with a subtle order, a quiet intelligence. It was as though the ocean itself had begun to speak in hints and murmurs, and he alone was attuned to them. He couldn't explain it, but he felt a sense of purpose he had never quite felt before. Patrick, of course, was blissfully unaware of the currents pulling at his friend's mind. That afternoon, the two of them wandered through the shallows near jellyfish fields, collecting small shells and laughing at the way the water carried them in circles. Patrick hummed a tuneless melody, and SpongeBob realized that the sound itself seemed to echo the pulse of the field from his dream. The connection was subtle, almost imperceptible, but he felt it deeply. It was as though the dream had left a trace in the waking world, a hint of something just beyond understanding. The shadows in his mind began to take on new shapes. They were no longer simply pauses or silences. They were hints, messages embedded in ordinary moments. A glance from Squidward, the tremor in Mr. Krabs's claw as he counted coins, the way Patrick's eyes lingered on a drifting jellyfish. They were all small signs, small truths, waiting for him to notice. SpongeBob began to realize that these were not burdens, but gifts, each offering him insight into the lives and hearts of those around him. One evening, as he wandered alone through jellyfish fields, the feeling of the dream returned, stronger and more insistent. The glowing jellyfish seemed to gather around him, forming soft, swirling patterns that beckoned him forward. He moved slowly, careful not to startle them, and found himself at the edge of a small, hidden cove he had never noticed before. The water here was still, reflecting the soft glow above like a mirrored sky. SpongeBob knelt beside it, peering into the depths, and for the first time he felt a strange thrill of recognition. It was as if the field, the cove, the very water itself were part of a puzzle he had been given to solve, though the solution remained tantalizingly out of reach. In that quiet moment, he understood something fundamental. Life was not merely the laughter, the work, the friendships he held so dear. It was also the noticing, the listening, the awareness that beneath the surface of every wave, beneath the cheer of every moment, there existed a hidden layer. And in that layer he could find connections, truths, even beauty that no one else seemed to see. The following days were filled with a new sense of attentiveness. SpongeBob began to act differently, though subtly. He lingered a moment longer when helping a customer, noticing the small details they didn't think to mention. He listened more carefully to Squidward, waiting for the hidden sorrow behind the sighs. He even spent quiet afternoons with Patrick, not speaking much, letting the hum of the ocean fill the space between them. The world, in its ordinary motions, had taken on an extraordinary depth, and SpongeBob felt both humbled and elated by it. Yet the dream and its echoes brought questions that could not be ignored.
What were the jellyfish trying to show him?
Was it merely a reflection of his own awareness, or something more, something alive and conscious within the sea itself? He could not answer. All he could do was follow the subtle tugs of curiosity, letting them guide him gently, without force, without expectation, and so he continued to explore, both in the waking world and in dreams, learning to walk alongside the shadows rather than flee from them. Each day became an exercise in attention, in noticing the invisible currents, in hearing the whispers that others overlooked. He discovered that kindness and awareness were inseparable, that to truly see another creature, he had to notice both the light and the shadow they carried. By the end of the week, SpongeBob felt a quiet exhilaration. He had glimpsed the deeper rhythm of the world, felt the pulse of life beneath the surface. It was a knowledge without answers, a truth without resolution, yet it filled him with a sense of purpose. And as he drifted off to sleep that night, the glowing jellyfish of his dream seemed to follow him into the pineapple, their gentle light casting patterns across the walls. For the first time, he didn't fear the darkness at all. He welcomed it, knowing that within it lay the next step of his journey, waiting to be discovered. And so the days flowed onward soft as the currents, carrying him toward experiences and revelations yet unseen, toward the quiet mysteries that shaped him in ways laughter alone never could. In every shadow he found a story, in every silence he heard a song, and in every moment he began to understand, slowly and surely, that the sea itself had lessons to teach, and he, SpongeBob, was listening. The rhythm of SpongeBob's days had begun to change, though outwardly everything seemed as usual. He laughed with the same boundless energy, he flipped patties with his characteristic zeal, he hummed tunelessly with Patrick as they wandered through jellyfish fields. But now there was an underlying attentiveness that had begun to shape his every action. He moved through the world as if it were a living melody, and he was learning to hear not only the notes, but the spaces between them, the silences that carried meaning. One morning, as sunlight filtered in pale streaks through the water, SpongeBob woke with a sense of anticipation he could not name. The previous night's dream had left him restless, yet curious. He remembered the glow of the endless jellyfish field, the way their soft light pulsed against the dark ocean floor, and the subtle sense that they were guiding him somewhere. The memory lingered as he dressed and prepared for the day, infusing even ordinary tasks with a gentle reverence at the Krusty Krab. The usual bustle proceeded as expected. Mr. Krabs fussed over the till. Squidward sighed through orders, and customers trickled in and out with predictable routines. SpongeBob, however, found himself noticing subtleties he had never seen before. The way a child's gaze lingered on a Krabby Patty before he took a bite. The gentle tremor in an elderly fish's fins as they counted out coins. Even the briefest expression of frustration on Squidward's face carried a note of longing, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. SpongeBob absorbed it all, letting it pass through him without judgment, understanding that each small gesture, each tiny heartbeat of emotion, held weight. After work, he met Patrick by their usual spot in Jellyfish Fields. The fields were brighter than ever, the sunlight scattering through the water to illuminate the soft coral and drifting jellyfish. But SpongeBob noticed something new. The jellyfish seemed to respond to him in a subtle way. As he moved among them, their pulses seemed to slow and then quicken, like a soft rhythm in response to his presence. He paused, reaching out with one hand, and felt a faint electric tingle as a small cluster drifted close. It was not startling or frightening, only remarkable, as if the ocean itself acknowledged him. Patrick, oblivious to the miracle, poked at a jellyfish and yelped when it twirled away, laughing. SpongeBob chuckled softly, a calm, reflective sound, and continued to observe the currents around him. He realized that his connection to the world had deepened, though he did not yet understand the extent of it. The shadows he had carried within him, the silent weight of dreams and quiet awareness,
had not dulled his joy, they had sharpened it.
opening him to things invisible to most. That evening, he returned home with a sense of calm anticipation, carrying a small notebook he had begun to keep. In it, he recorded subtle observations, the rhythm of the waves, the patterns of jellyfish, the fleeting expressions of his friends. The notebook was not for anyone else. It was a private map of the currents, a way to trace the hidden paths that ran beneath the surface of daily life. Each entry, each careful notation, seemed to bring him closer to understanding the unspoken world around him. As night fell, SpongeBob settled into bed, the soft glow of his lamp casting long shadows across the room. He lay on his back, listening to the gentle hum of the sea, feeling the slow pulse of life all around him. The dream returned, more vivid than before. He walked through the endless jellyfish field, their lights weaving intricate patterns, and the cove appeared once again, still dark and still mysterious. This time, however, he felt no fear. He approached the pool, peering into its depths, and for the first time he felt a sense of recognition, a quiet understanding that the ocean itself was a teacher, and he was both pupil and witness. The next day, SpongeBob noticed subtle changes in his interactions with others. At the Krusty Krab, he offered patience in ways that had previously seemed unnecessary. He lingered with a nervous customer, not just waiting but truly seeing them, understanding the hesitation behind their words. He helped Squidward carry a tray of dishes to the kitchen without fanfare, feeling the quiet tension in the other sponge's shoulders and responding with gentle, steady presence rather than conversation. Even Mr. Krabs received a kind word about his diligence, not as a joke or a ploy, but as an acknowledgement of something deeper. Each small act of recognition felt weighty and significant, as if attending to the currents of emotion around him strengthened his own connection to the world. Patrick noticed the difference, though he could not articulate it. "You're calmer," he said one afternoon as they lay on their backs in the sand, watching sunlight dance through the water. Like you're really seeing stuff now." SpongeBob smiled softly.
"I am," he said, feeling the truth of it in his chest. "I'm seeing things I didn't notice before. Not just the jellyfish or the waves.
But the spaces between everything, the quiet stuff that matters." Patrick nodded, content with the answer, though he didn't fully understand.
And that was enough.
Over the following weeks, SpongeBob began to sense an even deeper connection between himself and the ocean. The jellyfish fields became more than a place of play. They were a living lesson in attention and rhythm. Each pulse, each drift, each flicker of light offered him insight into the hidden patterns of life, if he only paused long enough to notice. And he did pause. He learned to move slowly, to listen, to let the currents guide him without rushing. In this quiet, reflective state, he discovered a subtle power, an ability to sense emotions, not just in others, but in the very flow of the world. The tides, the drifting sand, even the shimmer of distant light, he felt them all with a delicate, unspoken awareness. And as his awareness grew, so did his sense of purpose. It was not a purpose of grand gestures or heroic feats, but of presence. He realized that joy was most profound when it was intertwined with understanding, that kindness held its deepest meaning when paired with true attention. The shadows that had once seemed a weight now felt like guides, leading him toward the quiet knowledge that the most important acts are often invisible, carried out in the spaces between words and deeds. And so SpongeBob's days unfolded, each one a careful study of the currents, the laughter, the silences, and the shadows. Each night the dream returned, gently, insistently, offering new patterns, new lessons, and each morning he carried the lessons into the world, walking softly among his friends. His neighbors, the glowing jellyfish, the ever-shifting ocean, and learning to be not only a bringer of joy, but also a quiet witness to all the hidden movements that shaped the life around him. The ocean, he realized, had its own heartbeat, and he, SpongeBob, was beginning to listen. The days continued their gentle rhythm, each one a soft unfolding of light, water, and shadow. SpongeBob moved through them with the same familiar cheerfulness, yet the quiet awareness that had begun to shape him in Jellyfish Fields now stretched into every corner of his life. He noticed the tiniest tremor of emotion in a customer's glance, the way Squidward's shoulders sagged before a long sigh, the subtle tremble in Patrick's fins when he hesitated over a question that seemed trivial to everyone else. These small observations were no longer distractions, they were invitations. One morning, as he prepared for work, SpongeBob paused to watch the sunlight scatter across the rippling waves outside his window.
A single jellyfish drifted past, its glow reflecting on his floor like a tiny lantern.
He realized with a quiet thrill that he could almost feel its pulse, a soft vibration that mirrored the rhythm of his own heartbeat. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it filled him with a profound sense of connection. Perhaps this was what his dreams had been trying to teach him all along, that the world beneath the waves, the life of the sea itself, and the hearts of those around him were bound by invisible threads, delicate yet unbreakable. At the Krusty Krab, the day passed in its usual flurry of orders and frying. Mr. Krabs fussed over coins with the same habitual greed, yet SpongeBob could sense beneath the surface a tension and fear that the money alone could not soothe. Squidward, ever grumbling, seemed smaller somehow, weighed down by unspoken thoughts. SpongeBob found himself acting differently. He did not try to cheer or admonish, but he lingered, offering the quiet presence of attention. Sometimes that was enough. Squidward would glance at him with a flash of surprise, a momentary softening in his eyes before returning to his work. But SpongeBob felt the small victory of recognition. After closing, he wandered toward Jellyfish Fields, a place that had become both playground and teacher. Patrick trailed along, singing a faint, tuneless melody, blissfully unaware of the deeper currents of SpongeBob's awareness. The fields stretched wide and luminous, the jellyfish moving in soft arcs, their light pulsing like quiet, living lanterns. SpongeBob stopped, kneeling in the sand to observe the rhythm of their movements. Each pulse seemed deliberate, almost conversational, a subtle dialogue between the sea and himself. He reached out a hand, and one of the smaller jellyfish drifted close, brushing his fingers lightly. The sensation was electric, yet comforting, as if the ocean were acknowledging his presence. Inviting him deeper into its hidden language, Patrick, ever simple in his joy, poked a jellyfish and yelped in surprise, then laughed uncontrollably. SpongeBob chuckled at his friend's innocence, but his eyes remained on the larger patterns, the arcs and pulses of hundreds of jellyfish moving in quiet synchrony. He realized that the world was more than what one could see or hear. It was the invisible connections, the silent currents, the unspoken bonds between creatures and currents, between heart and heart. That evening, SpongeBob returned home with a sense of quiet anticipation. He retrieved his notebook, the pages filled with observations of light, movement, and emotion. Each entry was a mapping of hidden truths, small but significant. He wrote not to record for anyone else, but to make sense of the world as it whispered to him, to trace the subtle currents that he alone seemed to perceive. Sleep came slowly that night, though not restlessly. The dream returned, vivid as ever. He found himself once more in the glowing jellyfish fields, the endless expanse stretching farther than any known part of the ocean. The pool in the hidden cove shimmered at the center, dark and inviting. This time, however, he felt an unfamiliar sensation, responsibility. The glow of the jellyfish seemed to pulse in tandem with his heartbeat, and a soft, insistent voice hummed in his mind. Not words, but meaning, a lullaby of expectation. SpongeBob realized he was being asked to pay attention, to act, to carry something more than joy or curiosity. When he awoke, the sense of purpose lingered, a subtle weight that was neither burden nor fear. Over the following days, it began to manifest in small but deliberate actions. SpongeBob noticed when a customer hesitated over a decision and offered gentle guidance, never pushing, merely allowing them the space to make their own choice. He lingered near Squidward when the other sponge worked late, silently offering support without intrusion. With Patrick, he listened more deeply, hearing the unspoken questions in his friend's mind and allowing the silence between them to carry understanding. The world around him seemed to respond. Squidward's clarinet, once an instrument of irritation for SpongeBob, now resonated in a new way, the melancholy notes carrying unspoken stories that SpongeBob understood without explanation. Mr. Krabs, though still obsessed with his coins, seemed lighter, if only slightly, as if the quiet acknowledgement of his efforts softened the edges of his fear. Even the currents of jellyfish fields, the ebb and flow of light and shadow, pulsed with subtle recognition. SpongeBob's presence was no longer merely cheerful, it was attentive, reflective, present. One afternoon, as the two friends sat beneath the coral arches, Patrick suddenly asked, "Do you think the jellyfish ever get lonely?" The question hung in the water like a soft bell, and SpongeBob considered it carefully.
I think
Maybe they don't feel lonely the way we do, but they notice things. They feel things quietly without words. Maybe that's enough. Patrick nodded thoughtfully, though he did not fully understand, and they lapsed into silence, letting the pulse of the field speak for itself. By the end of the week, SpongeBob felt the first subtle stirrings of change in himself. He realized that joy was not simply about laughter or play. It was about presence, awareness, and connection. To notice the hidden rhythms of the world, to witness the small movements of life with patience and care. This was the quiet heroism that defined him now. The laughter remained bright and infectious, but it was accompanied by a gentler, deeper strength, the ability to perceive, to attend, to carry unseen weight without being crushed by it. And so the days unfolded, the currents of life moving steadily around him, the pulse of the jellyfish field echoing softly in his mind. SpongeBob knew that there was more to discover, more layers to the world beneath the waves, more shadows to understand and carry. But he also knew that he could walk this path, one careful, attentive step at a time. And as he drifted off to sleep that night, the glow of the dream returning to him, he felt no fear. He felt readiness, a quiet courage that came not from strength alone, but from understanding. The ocean hummed around him, the shadows whispered gently, and SpongeBob listened. Always he listened. The days grew longer, yet SpongeBob moved through them with a quiet intensity that was easy to miss if one did not pay close attention. Laughter and play remained his companions, but now they were tempered by the subtle rhythms he had begun to notice everywhere. The pulse of the jellyfish, the sighs of Squidward, the hesitant movements of a young fish learning to walk. Each observation became a small thread, weaving him more tightly into the fabric of the world around him. One morning, SpongeBob woke with the lingering echo of his dreams still clinging to the corners of his mind. The jellyfish field, endless and luminous, seemed to have grown stranger in the night. Clusters formed shapes that felt deliberate, almost like a language he could not yet understand. But this time he felt less like a visitor and more like a participant. He rose from his bed with quiet purpose, stroking Gary's shell as he left the pineapple, feeling that pulse of connection ripple through the water. The world seemed to breathe alongside him at the Krusty Krab. The usual bustle carried on. Mr. Krabs fretted over lost coins. Squidward muttered to himself as he stacked trays, and the customers came and went in predictable patterns. SpongeBob noticed the tiny hesitations, the shifts of weight, the slight changes in tone, and he responded not with exaggerated cheer, but with gentle attentiveness. A child, uncertain about whether to try a Krabby Patty, found SpongeBob kneeling patiently beside them, guiding rather than insisting. An elderly fish, unsure of how to count coins, was met with a steady, unhurried hand. Even Squidward received small, almost imperceptible gestures, a silent nod of acknowledgement, a moment of shared eye contact, a presence that said, without words, "I see you." After work, SpongeBob and Patrick wandered toward Jellyfish Fields. Patrick hummed quietly, lost in his own world, but SpongeBob moved with awareness, following the subtle currents of the water, feeling the light of the jellyfish pulse in gentle waves around him. It was no longer a simple game of chase. Each movement, each drift, each flutter of the jellyfish felt purposeful, almost conversational, and SpongeBob sensed that the field was teaching him something beyond observation, teaching him to respond, to act, to influence with gentleness and patience. That night, the dream returned with a new intensity. The endless fields of jellyfish stretched farther than ever before, their glow forming patterns that seemed almost like writing. SpongeBob approached the familiar cove at the center, its water dark and still, and for the first time he noticed reflections of creatures that were not entirely physical. Shadows moved beneath the water's surface, shifting in harmony with the light above. They were neither threatening nor frightening, only present,
as if urging him to recognize something deeper. That presence itself could be a form of influence.
and attention could shape reality in ways subtle yet profound. When he awoke, SpongeBob carried that realization into the day. He began to test the limits of this subtle influence in small ways. A hesitant customer at the Krusty Krab smiled after a quiet word of encouragement. A small jellyfish drifted closer to him, brushing against his hand in what felt like a gentle affirmation. Squidward, though still grumbling, paused mid-task to acknowledge his presence with a fleeting look that contained more gratitude than words could convey. SpongeBob felt these responses not as rewards, but as evidence of the quiet power in attentiveness, the soft heroism of noticing and responding with care. Patrick, naturally oblivious to the deeper currents at play, remained a mirror of innocence. He would laugh when SpongeBob pointed out patterns in the movements of jellyfish, or shrug at questions about the subtle shifts in emotion he observed around him. And yet, Patrick's presence offered SpongeBob a grounding simplicity, a reminder that the weight of perception need not overwhelm the joy of existence. Days passed, each building upon the last, and SpongeBob began to notice more pronounced effects of his subtle influence. The children who came to the Krusty Krab laughed a little longer, their hesitations softened. Squidward's clarinet playing grew steadier, the notes carrying a resonance that suggested his spirit was lighter than it had been in months. Even Mr. Krabs, while obsessing over coins as usual, allowed himself brief moments of pause, his attention lingering on the world around him rather than the counting alone. SpongeBob realized, with quiet awe, that the world responded not just to action, but to presence, to attentiveness, to the quiet willingness to notice and care. His laughter had always been bright, but now it was informed by subtle understanding. His joy was not a shield against the shadows. It was a conduit through which he could gently guide, comfort, and influence without intrusion. One evening, as the sun dimmed and the ocean floor glimmered with bioluminescent life, SpongeBob wandered alone in Jellyfish Fields. The jellyfish swirled around him in patterns he had not seen before, their pulses slow and deliberate, almost in conversation. He knelt beside a drifting cluster, feeling the rhythm of their movement echo against his own heartbeat. It was a moment of profound stillness, a reminder that even in the absence of words or grand gestures, connection could flourish, and as night fell, SpongeBob returned home with the calm certainty that his quiet journey was becoming something more than personal growth. The subtle attentiveness, the patient care, the gentle influence All these small acts were shaping the lives around him, just as the world shaped him in return. Shadows had transformed from burdens into teachers, laughter into a tool of resonance, and silence into a language rich with meaning. As he drifted to sleep, the dream once again visited him. The jellyfish field stretched endlessly, glowing softly against the dark water. The familiar cove waited at the center, its depths reflecting more than light, reflecting potential, responsibility, and the quiet power of presence. SpongeBob smiled softly, feeling a sense of readiness he had never known before. The world was speaking, and he was finally learning not only to listen, but to respond carefully, patiently, and with kindness. In the gentle stillness, he understood something essential: the smallest gestures, the quietest attentions, the presence offered without expectation. These were the acts that shaped the world in ways no one could measure. And he, SpongeBob, was beginning to see the shape of that influence, feeling its pulse beneath the waves, and knowing that his journey, though quiet and subtle, was meaningful beyond words. The early morning sun spilled through the water in long, golden shafts, illuminating the streets of Bikini Bottom in a quiet brilliance. SpongeBob woke with a sense of gentle anticipation, the subtle thrill of possibility curling inside him like a soft wave. His dreams had faded only to leave a lingering rhythm, a memory of the glowing jellyfish field and the hidden cove that had begun to feel less like a vision and more like a promise. Today, he sensed, the currents of his quiet attentiveness might stretch beyond observation, carrying their influence further than he had dared imagine. At the Krusty Krab, the usual routine unfolded with comforting familiarity. Customers moved through the restaurant, each carrying small, unspoken worries or fleeting moments of joy. SpongeBob noticed the hesitant pauses of a young fish unsure of ordering, the tired sigh of an elderly patron counting coins, the restless tapping of a nervous customer's fins. Yet this morning, his presence carried an unspoken reassurance. As he handed a tray of Krabby Patties to a boy who had lingered too long at the counter, he met his gaze and offered a quiet smile. The boy returned it almost instinctively, and SpongeBob felt the pulse of acknowledgement pass between them, subtle yet profound. Squidward, as always, remained difficult to read. He moved with measured exasperation, the clarinet tucked under his arm, the weight of routine pressing down upon him. But SpongeBob, now attuned to the nuances of the unseen currents, noticed a slight tension in Squidward's shoulders that shifted as their eyes met. Without fanfare or words, he nodded, a simple gesture, acknowledging the small struggles and quiet strengths that often went unnoticed. For a brief instant, Squidward paused, letting the moment settle in before returning to his music. Yet the pause itself was a small triumph, a ripple in the sea of habitual motions that had defined their interactions for years. After closing, SpongeBob and Patrick wandered toward Jellyfish Fields, as they often did, though their purpose had subtly changed. Patrick hummed a soft, tuneless melody, unaware that the landscape itself seemed to respond to SpongeBob's quiet awareness. The glowing jellyfish drifted around them in intricate, slow arcs, pulsating as if carrying the rhythm of some ancient, invisible music. SpongeBob extended a hand, letting the light brush against his fingertips, feeling the currents hum in harmony with his own heartbeat. The cove appeared again, its dark, reflective waters inviting contemplation. This time, SpongeBob paused for longer, kneeling at its edge. The shadows beneath the water moved in gentle swirls, forming shapes that seemed deliberate, almost like faint impressions of emotion. He watched, listening, not with ears, but with the attentive stillness of presence, and realized that the world around him, the field, the cove, the creatures he had always called friends, was beginning to respond to him in subtle ways. The acknowledgement was not loud or overt. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. Patrick, oblivious to the quiet exchange, tugged at SpongeBob's arm. "Come on, Let's race the jellyfish." His laughter broke the meditative moment, and SpongeBob smiled, following his friend through the gently pulsing field. The playful chase carried them in circles, the water wrapping around their movements like a soft, approving embrace. And yet, beneath the playfulness, SpongeBob sensed the threads of influence stretching outward. His attention to the currents, the rhythms, the small expressions of emotion was shaping the field, subtly harmonizing with the natural ebb and flow of life around him. Back in town, the effects were quieter but equally meaningful. A nervous customer at the Krusty Krab lingered a little less in hesitation, a shy smile breaking through before the next bite. Squidward's music carried a softer, steadier resonance, the melancholy tempered by moments of subtle brightness. Mr. Krabs, still meticulous about his coins, allowed himself fleeting attention to his surroundings, a brief glance at the passing water outside that spoke more than words ever could. SpongeBob noticed these changes with a quiet joy. They were not the result of heroics or dramatic interventions. They were the fruits of patience, presence, and attentiveness, a slow ripple spreading outward into lives touched by unseen currents, weaving as the sun dipped lower and the water glowed with bioluminescence. SpongeBob wandered through jellyfish fields alone, allowing the quiet to envelop him fully. The jellyfish pulsed softly, drifting in arcs and spirals that seemed increasingly deliberate, almost conversational. He knelt beside a cluster, feeling their subtle electrical pulse brush against his hands, and realized that his own rhythm, his own presence, had become part of the harmony. In the calm of the field, he understood that influence need not shout to be felt. To notice, to acknowledge, to hold space for another being's existence, this was the form of heroism he was learning to wield. That night, the dream returned in a softer, more contemplative form. The glowing fields stretched endlessly, their pulses forming gentle waves of light. The hidden cove appeared at the center, dark yet inviting, and for the first time, SpongeBob sensed the possibility of guidance within it. Shadows moved beneath the surface with a quiet deliberation, as if offering hints rather than answers. The jellyfish pulsed in patterns that seemed almost like instructions, gentle nudges toward understanding, toward connection, toward action without demand. SpongeBob felt a profound sense of responsibility not to command, not to alter recklessly, but to continue observing, listening, and responding with care. Morning came with a renewed sense of purpose. SpongeBob moved through the day with the soft intensity of someone who understood that even the smallest gestures could carry weight. He lingered with a shy fish, allowed Squidward a quiet moment to play freely, and offered Mr. Krabs a gentle nod of reassurance as coins were counted. Every act, no matter how subtle, felt significant, and SpongeBob carried it with humility. By week's end, the subtle ripples he had begun to create in the lives of others had become more noticeable. The laughter at the Krusty Krab was softer but more genuine, the music steadier, the currents in jellyfish fields more harmonious. SpongeBob realized that his journey was no longer just about self-discovery. It was about shaping the world around him through quiet attention, gentle acknowledgement, and the steady, unassuming presence he had cultivated. Shadows no longer pressed upon him. They were guides.
Laughter no longer masked uncertainty. It was a conduit for subtle influence.
And silence, above all, was a language rich with meaning. As he drifted to sleep that night, the dream returned once more. The glowing jellyfish field stretched endlessly, the cove reflecting possibilities rather than answers. Shadows swirled beneath the surface, carrying unspoken messages of guidance and quiet power. SpongeBob smiled softly, knowing that his journey was far from over. He was learning not merely to see, but to notice, not merely to laugh, but to influence, not merely to exist, but to resonate in the gentle darkness. With the pulse of the sea echoing in his mind, SpongeBob understood something fundamental, that the world in all its complexity, responded to those who truly listened, who truly acknowledged, who truly held space for its subtle currents. And he, SpongeBob, was beginning to become not just a part of the world, but a quiet, shaping presence within it. The morning light drifted softly through the water, carrying with it a sense of possibility that SpongeBob could almost taste. The pulse of the ocean beneath him felt different today, gentler yet deliberate, as though the currents themselves were watching, waiting for him to step into a new layer of understanding. The quiet heroism he had been cultivating, through attentiveness, small gestures, and presence, was beginning to ripple outward beyond the confines of the Krusty Krab or jellyfish fields. SpongeBob could feel it, subtle yet undeniable, as though the world itself responded when he approached with mindfulness. At the Krusty Krab, the day began as usual. Yet SpongeBob noticed the small things that often went unseen, the anxious tremor in a young customer's fin, the way Squidward's eyes softened for the briefest moment when a customer complimented his clarinet, the slight hesitation in Mr. Krabs' movements as he contemplated a new idea for the restaurant. This morning, SpongeBob moved among them differently. He spoke with quiet intention, listened with gentle patience, and allowed his presence to create space for understanding. A shy customer smiled nervously when he offered a word of reassurance. Squidward, usually curt, nodded almost imperceptibly, and Mr. Krabs paused just long enough to notice the water sparkling beyond the window. After work, SpongeBob and Patrick wandered toward Jellyfish Fields as they often did. Patrick, humming his usual tuneless melody, trailed behind, blissfully unaware of the currents SpongeBob had begun to perceive and influence. The glowing jellyfish pulsed with a rhythm that felt more like a conversation than mere light. SpongeBob moved among them slowly, deliberately, allowing the subtle vibrations to brush against his fingertips, guiding his own heartbeat in quiet harmony with theirs. Each interaction, each gentle touch, seemed to awaken the creatures to a deeper sense of presence, as if the field itself recognized him not just as a visitor, but as a companion in its hidden language. The familiar cove appeared once again, its waters dark and reflective. SpongeBob knelt at the edge, studying the shadows beneath the surface. They swirled gently, responding to his gaze, almost like ink carried by a slow current. He realized with a sense of quiet wonder that the subtle attention he offered was shaping not just the physical movements of the jellyfish, but the emotional currents of the world around him. The world was listening, he understood, and what he did, or did not do, mattered in ways that were invisible yet significant. Patrick, oblivious to the deeper lesson, tugged at SpongeBob's arm. "Let's see who can catch the most jellyfish today," he said, grinning. SpongeBob smiled, letting the joy of friendship mingle with the quiet intensity of observation. The chase was playful, yet it now carried a new depth. Every movement was a dance of awareness, every laugh a note in a song of subtle influence. Even in their play, SpongeBob felt that the rhythms of his presence were shaping the world in small but meaningful ways. As the days unfolded, the subtle effects of SpongeBob's attentiveness began to extend beyond his immediate circle. A young fish who had always been hesitant at the Krusty Krab now approached the counter with a quiet confidence, encouraged by a small word of guidance from SpongeBob. Squidward, though still his usual curmudgeon, played his clarinet with a steadier hand, the music flowing more freely, carrying unspoken gratitude in its notes. Even Mr. Krabs, while still focused on coins, allowed himself moments of pause, noticing the shimmer of light on the water outside, the gentle sway of the coral, and the small joys he had long overlooked. One evening, SpongeBob wandered through Jellyfish Fields alone, feeling the quiet energy of the ocean surrounding him. The jellyfish drifted in arcs and spirals, their soft glow illuminating the field like floating lanterns. SpongeBob knelt beside a cluster, feeling their electric pulses brush against his hands, and sensed a deeper truth. Influence did not require grand gestures or dramatic interventions. It existed in the act of presence, in the steady acknowledgement of life around him, in the patient attention that allowed others to exist fully in their own rhythms. That night, the dream returned, stretching farther and deeper than ever before. The jellyfish field glowed endlessly, their pulses forming intricate, unspoken patterns. The hidden cove at the center shimmered, reflecting not just light, but the potential of intention and presence. Shadows swirled beneath the surface, moving deliberately, carrying messages that were almost tangible, urging SpongeBob to continue not with force or command, but with quiet attentiveness and understanding. He felt a sense of responsibility unlike any before, not a burden, but a gift, a reminder that even the smallest gestures could ripple outward in ways that mattered. The following morning, SpongeBob approached the day with a renewed sense of purpose. He lingered with hesitant customers, offered subtle support to Squidward, and acknowledged Mr. Krabs' meticulous efforts with quiet reassurance. Each act, though small, felt deliberate, a gentle shaping of the currents of emotion and attention around him. He understood now that laughter alone could not create change, that joy paired with awareness could transform not just the moment, but the subtle energies that guided the lives of those around him. In the quiet moments of the day, SpongeBob began to see the cumulative effect of his attentiveness. The Krusty Krab hummed with a gentler rhythm. Squidward's music carried richer tones. Children approached with growing confidence. Even the landscape of Bikini Bottom, the currents, the light, the hidden corners of coral, seemed to pulse with recognition. The world was responding softly, subtly, yet unmistakably, to the presence of one who listened, one who noticed, one who acted with quiet care. By the week's end, SpongeBob realized that his journey had entered a new stage. The attention and subtle influence he cultivated were no longer confined to dreams or private reflection. They extended into the lives of others, shaping moments, moods, and the very rhythm of daily life. Shadows no longer pressed upon him, they guided him. Laughter no longer distracted, it illuminated. Silence no longer separated, it connected. As he drifted to sleep that night, the dream returned once more. The glowing jellyfish stretched infinitely, their pulses forming delicate patterns in the dark water. The hidden cove awaited, its depths reflecting possibilities, yet unseen. Shadows moved beneath the surface, carrying the quiet assurance that SpongeBob's presence mattered, that his attention, care, and patience were shaping the world in ways both subtle and profound. And as he smiled softly in the dream, he understood that his journey, though quiet and unassuming, was becoming something larger than he had ever imagined, a gentle force weaving harmony into the currents of life itself. The morning water shimmered with a soft, golden light, gentle enough to make the entire town of Bikini Bottom seem wrapped in a quiet embrace. SpongeBob awoke with the lingering echo of last night's dream, the pulse of the glowing jellyfish still faintly resonating in his chest. The memory of their soft, rhythmic light carried a lesson he could not yet articulate. That connection, true, attentive connection, was a force that could shape the currents of life itself. At the Krusty Krab, the day began with the familiar cadence of orders and sizzling patties. Yet for SpongeBob, every moment felt heavier with quiet possibility. He noticed the hesitation of a young fish lingering at the counter, the anxious tremor of another counting coins, and the subtle slump in Squidward's posture as he approached his clarinet. SpongeBob moved among them with care, offering gestures small and unobtrusive, a gentle nod, a patient smile, a soft word that carried acknowledgement without pressure. Each act was intentional, a quiet recognition of the unseen burdens that lived in others' hearts. Squidward, often distant and curt, seemed increasingly affected by SpongeBob's subtle presence. When a child laughed at the smell of a Krabby Patty fresh off the grill, Squidward's frown softened for the briefest moment. SpongeBob noticed it, though he said nothing, simply allowing the moment to exist. He understood that presence could speak more deeply than words. That acknowledgement without intrusion often carried the greatest weight. Mr. Krabs, fussing as always over his till, allowed his attention to drift for a moment toward the shimmer of sunlight on the water outside, unaware of the subtle shift in his own perception. After closing, SpongeBob led Patrick toward Jellyfish Fields. Patrick, humming softly, moved with his usual carefree rhythm, unaware of the undercurrents SpongeBob now sensed and influenced. The jellyfish swirled in gentle arcs, their glow a living rhythm that matched the slow pulse of SpongeBob's awareness. He knelt in the soft sand, brushing a cluster of jellyfish with his fingertips. Each pulse, each tremor of light, seemed almost responsive, as if the creatures themselves recognized the shift in him. The cove waited at the center, dark and reflective. SpongeBob lingered at its edge, peering into its depths. The shadows beneath the water moved slowly, deliberately, forming shapes that hinted at thought, emotion, and quiet guidance. He realized that influence need not be loud or commanding. It could be gentle, unassuming, and entirely effective. The simplest attention, the kind that bore no expectation, was capable of shaping the world in ways that remained invisible to the untrained eye, but profound nonetheless. Patrick tugged at SpongeBob's arm, breaking the stillness.
"Let's see who can catch the most jellyfish,"
he said with a laugh. SpongeBob smiled and followed, the playful chase now carrying a depth he had not felt before. Each twist and turn, each gentle brush of the jellyfish against their fingertips, seemed to carry a message that even in moments of play, the rhythms of attention and care could ripple outward. In the days that followed, SpongeBob noticed subtle changes in his community. The children who visited the Krusty Krab approached with newfound confidence, encouraged by his quiet acknowledgement. Squidward's music, usually sharp and guarded, carried a warmer resonance, notes flowing more freely, imbued with the briefest hints of relief and gratitude. Even Mr. Krabs, though still focused on the counting of coins, allowed himself small pauses, observing the shimmer of coral and sunlight, recognizing beauty he had long ignored. SpongeBob realized that his journey was no longer just about self-awareness. It was about the subtle shaping of the world through patience, attentiveness, and gentle care. One evening, SpongeBob wandered through Jellyfish Fields alone. The glow of the jellyfish filled the water in gentle arcs and spirals, illuminating the sand and coral with soft, living lanterns. He knelt beside a drifting cluster, feeling their faint electric pulse, and understood a new truth. Influence was less about action and more about presence. The world, he realized, responded to attention, acknowledgement, and care in ways that were invisible yet deeply transformative. That night, the dream returned, stretching farther than ever before. The endless jellyfish field shimmered, pulsing in deliberate patterns that seemed to form an almost tangible language. The hidden cove reflected possibilities yet unexplored, shadows moving beneath the water in deliberate guiding swirls. SpongeBob felt a gentle responsibility settling over him, not the weight of expectation, but the quiet knowledge that his attention, his presence, and his understanding could shape the lives of those around him in subtle yet profound ways. The following morning, SpongeBob approached the day with renewed intention. He lingered with hesitant customers, offered unspoken support to Squidward, and acknowledged Mr. Krabs' careful diligence with a soft word of encouragement. Each gesture, no matter how small, carried weight because it was offered with awareness, not obligation. Laughter was still present, but now it was tempered with understanding, capable of touching hearts more deeply than any joke or jest. By midweek, SpongeBob began to witness small moments of revelation in others. A young fish who had always been timid at the counter approached with confidence and smiled shyly at SpongeBob, who simply returned the gesture. Squidward played his clarinet with a steadier hand, the melancholy tempered by a quiet undercurrent of relief. Even Patrick, often oblivious, seemed more attuned, pausing in his own play to notice subtle shifts in the field around them. SpongeBob realized that these were not grand heroic feats, but the quiet transformations that mattered most, a ripple effect born of presence, attentiveness, and care. As night fell, the dream returned once more. The jellyfish glowed endlessly, forming intricate patterns that seemed to carry meaning just beyond understanding. The cove's depths reflected the possibilities of influence, responsibility, and quiet courage. Shadows swirled beneath the surface, whispering guidance that required no words. SpongeBob, lying in the gentle darkness, felt a profound sense of readiness. He had learned not only to see, to laugh and to notice, but to influence subtly, to shape the emotional currents around him with patience and care. And in that moment, as the pulses of the jellyfish echoed in his chest, SpongeBob understood something essential. True impact was rarely loud or immediate. It existed in the quiet attentions, the gentle acknowledgments, the patient presence that allowed life to flow naturally, while shaping it gently from within. He closed his eyes, carrying the rhythm of the ocean, the soft light of the jellyfish, and the subtle transformations he had witnessed into sleep, ready to continue a journey that was quietly, yet profoundly, reshaping his world. The ocean that morning held a hushed reverence, as though the entire expanse of Bikini Bottom had paused to listen. SpongeBob awoke slowly, feeling the subtle rhythm of the currents beneath him, the pulse of life in every bubble, every shift of sand, every gentle flicker of light through the water. He carried with him the quiet awareness that had been growing over days and weeks, the understanding that presence, attentiveness, and care could ripple outward, unseen but profoundly felt. Today, he sensed, those ripples might take on a new depth, touching hearts and minds in ways he had only begun to comprehend. At the Krusty Krab, the morning unfolded with familiar motions, yet SpongeBob's perception of them had shifted. He moved among the customers and colleagues with a gentle attentiveness, noticing the small hesitations, the faint glimmers of joy, and the unspoken questions in every glance. A young fish hesitated before ordering a Krabby Patty, his fins trembling slightly. SpongeBob knelt to meet his gaze, speaking softly. "Take your time. I'm right here." The child's tension eased almost immediately, a shy smile breaking across his face, and SpongeBob felt the subtle warmth of connection settle in the quiet space between them. Squidward, moving with his usual meticulous exasperation, seemed slightly different today. His clarinet, once a source of sharp-edged melancholy, produced notes that shimmered with a restrained tenderness. SpongeBob noticed, nodding in quiet acknowledgement. Squidward paused briefly,
as if sensing the recognition, and then continued,
a slight softness in his expression that spoke volumes. Mr. Krabs, coins in hand, allowed himself a pause to watch a stray sunbeam dance across the water, the shimmer catching his eye and reminding him, for a fleeting moment, that there was beauty beyond the till. After closing, SpongeBob and Patrick wandered toward Jellyfish Fields. Patrick hummed his usual tuneless melody, trailing behind, blissfully unaware of the deeper currents SpongeBob now sensed and influenced. The jellyfish drifted in gentle spirals, their soft glow pulsing in harmony with SpongeBob's awareness. He knelt in the sand, brushing their filaments lightly with his fingertips, sensing not just movement, but the emotion embedded within each pulse. The field felt alive in a new way, responsive to the gentle care he offered, and SpongeBob realized that these small interactions had become an unspoken dialogue between himself and the living ocean around him. The hidden cove waited, its dark, reflective waters offering quiet invitation. SpongeBob lingered at the edge, peering into the depths, where shadows moved like slow whispers beneath the surface. He realized that influence was not a matter of doing, but of being, of acknowledging, holding space, and responding with patient attentiveness. The cove, like the world itself, seemed to reflect the balance he had been cultivating, a delicate harmony between presence and action, observation and participation, stillness and gentle guidance. Patrick tugged at his arm.
Race me to the coral ridge.
He laughed, bounding ahead. SpongeBob followed, letting the playful chase carry him, the rhythmic pulses of the jellyfish brushing against his hands as they ran. Even in this simple act, he noticed the subtle ways attention shaped perception. Patrick paused briefly, noticing the glow of a cluster of jellyfish. A small school of fish darted closer, curious but unafraid. SpongeBob smiled, realizing that influence was not grand gestures but these small, attentive moments rippling outward with quiet power. Over the next few days, SpongeBob began to notice the subtle but meaningful changes in his community. Children approached the Krusty Krab with less hesitation, smiling more freely, emboldened by the gentle guidance and acknowledgement he offered. Squidward's music became steadier, the notes softer, carrying a quiet resonance that spoke of restrained relief and subtle joy. Even Mr. Krabs, meticulous as ever, allowed brief moments of observation beyond his coins, catching glimpses of the world around him in ways he had long ignored. SpongeBob understood that these small shifts, almost imperceptible, were profound in their cumulative effect, a quiet reshaping of emotional currents in the lives around him. One evening, alone in jellyfish fields, SpongeBob knelt beside a drifting cluster of glowing jellyfish, feeling their faint electric pulses against his fingertips. The rhythm of their glow seemed to synchronize with his own heartbeat, and he sensed the harmony between presence and influence more clearly than ever before. The world responded not to force or grand gestures, but to steady, attentive care, a gentle attentiveness that allowed life to unfold naturally while subtly shaping it from within. That night, the dream returned, stretching endlessly across the glowing jellyfish fields. The hidden cove reflected possibilities yet uncharted, its depths dark but inviting. Shadows beneath the surface moved with deliberate, guiding motion, forming intricate, almost imperceptible patterns. SpongeBob felt the gentle weight of responsibility settle over him, not a burden, but a quiet acknowledgement of the unseen ways his presence shaped the world. He realized that influence, in its purest form, was not about change imposed from the outside, but about resonance, attentiveness, and care. The following morning, SpongeBob approached his day with renewed intention. He lingered with hesitant customers, offered gentle reassurance to Squidward, and acknowledged Mr. Krabs' careful attention to the coins and counters with quiet appreciation. Each gesture, however small, carried significance precisely because it was offered with awareness, presence, and patience. Laughter continued to flow, but now it carried a depth that touched hearts more than mere sound or mirth could achieve. By the middle of the week, SpongeBob began to see the broader effects of his attentiveness. Children approached with confidence, emboldened by his quiet encouragement. Squidward's music resonated with deeper richness, notes shaped not by obligation, but by the soft recognition of support. Even Patrick, typically oblivious, seemed more attuned, pausing to notice the gentle glow of jellyfish or the subtle motions of the currents around him. SpongeBob understood that these were not grand acts of heroism, but the quiet, meaningful transformations that mattered most, ripples of presence, patience, and care flowing outward to shape lives in small but profound ways. As night fell, the dream returned once more. The jellyfish glowed with infinite patterns, forming intricate, delicate motifs across the darkened water. The cove reflected not just light, but potential, the potential of influence, presence, and quiet courage. Shadows moved beneath the surface, whispering guidance that required no words. SpongeBob, lying in the gentle darkness, felt an expansive readiness. He had learned not only to see, to laugh, and to notice, but to shape the world subtly with patience, attentiveness,
and care. In that quiet, luminous space, SpongeBob understood a simple but essential truth, that the world,
in all its depth and complexity, responded to those who truly listened, acknowledged and held space for life's currents. And he, SpongeBob, was beginning to become not only a part of the world, but a gentle, shaping presence within it. The ocean carried a soft, reflective hush that morning, as if the currents themselves were pausing to breathe. SpongeBob awoke slowly, the quiet rhythm of the water threading through his thoughts. Over the weeks he had learned to perceive the hidden pulses beneath the ordinary motions of life, the subtle tremor of hesitation in a young fish's fin, the faint tension in Squidward's shoulders, the unnoticed beauty in Mr. Krabs' fleeting glances toward sunlight on the coral. Today he felt a deeper pull, a sense that these small currents of attentiveness and presence were moving towards something broader, something that asked not for action, but for reflection. At the Krusty Krab, the familiar morning bustle unfolded, yet SpongeBob approached it with a renewed sense of quiet purpose. He lingered with shy customers, offering gentle smiles and soft words, noticing the nuances of their emotions as they ordered. One child who had once hesitated at the counter approached with a shy confidence, a small grin lighting their face. SpongeBob returned the smile, allowing the connection to exist without words, feeling the subtle warmth of acknowledgement settle between them. Squidward's clarinet echoed across the restaurant, the notes now carrying a softer, steadier tone, the music resonating with a quiet reassurance that SpongeBob had come to recognize as an expression of shared understanding. Even Mr. Krabs, coins in hand, seemed to move with a slightly lighter rhythm, noticing the shimmer of light through the water and pausing briefly, just long enough to acknowledge the world beyond the till. SpongeBob watched quietly, realizing that influence did not need fanfare or notice. It existed in the steady presence that allowed others to feel seen, acknowledged, and supported. Every small act, every quiet attention given freely, carried weight and spread outward like ripples across the ocean's surface. After work, SpongeBob and Patrick wandered toward Jellyfish Fields. Patrick's tuneless hum floated lazily behind him, and SpongeBob, as always, moved with a deliberate awareness of the subtle rhythms around him. The glowing jellyfish drifted in spirals, responding not only to the currents, but to SpongeBob's gentle attentiveness. Kneeling in the soft sand, he brushed a cluster lightly with his fingers, feeling the faint electric pulse echo against his own heartbeat. The field seemed alive with recognition, as though his presence had become part of its natural rhythm. The hidden cove beckoned once more, its waters dark and reflective, inviting quiet contemplation. SpongeBob lingered at the edge, observing the shadows beneath the surface. They swirled in deliberate patterns, carrying an almost imperceptible sense of guidance. He understood now that influence was not the loud or dramatic act of heroism, but the quiet, consistent shaping of currents through presence, patience, and care. The cove reflected not only the world around him, but the unfolding of his own understanding, that small attentions given freely held the power to transform without force. Patrick, oblivious to the deeper rhythm, tugged at SpongeBob's arm.
"Race me to the coral ridge,"
he laughed. SpongeBob allowed himself to join, moving with the playful joy of friendship. Yet every step, every brush of the jellyfish carried the subtle awareness of connection. Even in moments of play, influence existed, not in dominance or command, but in the quiet shaping of interactions, in the gentle acknowledgement of life around him. Over the next days, SpongeBob's attentiveness began to manifest in broader, more meaningful ways. The children at the Krusty Krab approached with a confidence and warmth that had been absent before, emboldened by his gentle presence. Squidward's music continued to deepen, the once sharp melancholy tempered by soft harmonies that carried unspoken relief. Mr. Krabs, meticulous as ever, allowed fleeting pauses to notice the beauty in the world around him, the shimmer of sunlight, the gentle sway of the coral, the laugh of a child. SpongeBob recognized these changes not as grand gestures, but as quiet reflections of the influence he had cultivated through patient care and mindful attention. One evening, alone in Jellyfish Fields, SpongeBob knelt beside a cluster of glowing jellyfish, feeling their pulses sync with the gentle rhythm of his own heartbeat. The ocean around him seemed to sigh with recognition, as if acknowledging the subtle harmony he had helped create. He realized that influence was less about action and more about being, less about shaping outcomes and more about holding space for life to unfold naturally, guided by the quiet currents of awareness and care. That night, the dream returned, stretching across the glowing jellyfish fields in infinite patterns. The hidden cove reflected light and possibility, its depths dark but inviting, shadows moving with deliberate guiding motion. SpongeBob felt the gentle weight of understanding settle over him, that his journey had become one of quiet legacy, shaping lives not through grandiose acts, but through consistent, mindful presence. The dream carried a soft reassurance, whispering that even small attentions could leave profound marks on hearts and currents alike. The following morning, SpongeBob moved through the day with an understanding that bordered on reverence. He lingered with hesitant customers, offered quiet support to Squidward, and acknowledged Mr. Krabs' meticulousness with gentle appreciation. Each gesture, each moment of presence became a quiet thread woven into the tapestry of the world around him. Laughter, smiles, and music carried a resonance deeper than sound alone, echoing the harmony that had begun to unfold throughout Bikini Bottom. By the end of the week, the subtle ripples of SpongeBob's influence had spread far enough to touch multiple lives, shaping emotional currents that were both visible and unseen. Children approached confidently, Squidward played with newfound richness, Patrick paused to notice subtle details in the field, and even Mr. Krabs allowed fleeting glimpses of wonder beyond his coins. SpongeBob understood that his heroism, quiet and unassuming,
had become a legacy in itself, a gentle shaping of the world through care,
patience, and attention. As night fell, the dream returned one final time, stretching endlessly across glowing jellyfish fields and dark, reflective waters. Shadows moved beneath the surface in deliberate, guiding motions, the cove reflecting the depth of influence, presence, and understanding SpongeBob had cultivated. He felt a sense of completion, not as an ending, but as a continuation, a quiet culmination of the lessons he had learned, the connections he had nurtured, and the gentle power of attentive care. In that luminous stillness, SpongeBob understood that his journey, though quiet and subtle, had left an enduring mark. The world responded to those who truly listened, who noticed, who held space with care and attentiveness. And he, SpongeBob, had become not just a part of the world, but a gentle, shaping presence within it. Lying in the soft darkness, he breathed in the rhythm of the currents, the glow of the jellyfish, and the quiet harmony he had helped create, drifting into a calm, restorative sleep. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. The ocean lay in a quiet hush that morning, the surface shimmering like spun gold as the first rays of sunlight pierced the water. SpongeBob stirred slowly, feeling the gentle pulse of the currents brush against him, a soft rhythm that had become as familiar and reassuring as his own heartbeat. Over weeks of small attentions, quiet observations, and mindful presence, the world around him had begun to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Today there was no urgency, no pressing need, only a sense of reflection, a gentle invitation to witness the ripples he had created, and to feel the weight and wonder of the quiet legacy he had begun to weave at the Krusty Krab. The morning unfolded with its usual motions, yet SpongeBob noticed more than ever before. Hesitant customers approached with small smiles, their nervousness tempered by the soft encouragement he offered. Children lingered a moment longer, savoring the warmth of recognition in his gaze. Squidward's clarinet filled the restaurant, its tones steady, reflective, carrying a subtle richness that seemed to echo the quiet influence of SpongeBob's attentiveness. Even Mr. Krabs, coins counted and organized as always, allowed himself a brief pause to observe the glimmering water beyond the window, noticing the play of light on the coral and the gentle sway of the ocean around him. SpongeBob moved through these interactions with care, each gesture deliberate but unassuming, a nod, a smile, a soft word that required no response but offered connection. He understood, more fully than ever, that influence need not be grand or dramatic. It existed in presence, in patient listening, in the gentle acknowledgement of life's rhythms. The subtle attentions he had cultivated over time were no longer isolated acts. They were threads woven into the tapestry of the lives around him, quietly reshaping currents of emotion and awareness. After closing, SpongeBob wandered to Jellyfish Fields with Patrick, the soft hum of his friend's tuneless melody trailing behind. The glowing jellyfish drifted lazily, their gentle pulses forming an intricate, living pattern that seemed to mirror SpongeBob's own heartbeat. He knelt among them, brushing a hand lightly through their filaments, feeling the faint electricity vibrate in harmony with his awareness. The field seemed alive in a new way, responsive to the subtle energy he offered, as though recognizing that his presence had become part of its natural rhythm. The hidden cove awaited him, dark and reflective, a quiet sanctuary for contemplation. SpongeBob lingered at the edge, watching the shadows beneath the water swirl slowly, deliberately, carrying messages he could not fully articulate, but felt deeply in his chest. He realized that the quiet influence he wielded, the careful attention, the patient acknowledgement, the gentle shaping of emotional currents, was his true gift, not measured in accolades or recognition, but in the harmony it fostered in the lives of others. Patrick, oblivious to the depths of this understanding, bounded ahead laughing. SpongeBob followed, letting the joy of friendship flow freely while still sensing the quiet pulse of life around them. Even in play, he noticed the subtle ways attention shaped perception. A child watching from afar felt emboldened to approach. A small school of fish lingered near, curious and unafraid. SpongeBob smiled softly, recognizing that influence. When rooted in care and attentiveness, did not demand recognition. It simply moved outward, shaping the world gently, inevitably, like a tide caressing the shore. Over the following days, SpongeBob observed the cumulative effects of his presence. Children approached the Krusty Krab with confidence and curiosity. Squidward's music resonated with a gentler richness, and Mr. Krabs, while still devoted to his coins, allowed fleeting moments of wonder as he noticed the small, beautiful details of the ocean around him. SpongeBob understood that these changes were not immediate or dramatic, but subtle and profound, ripples in the emotional and perceptual currents that would continue to expand long after any single act of attention. One quiet evening, SpongeBob returned to Jellyfish Fields alone. The glowing jellyfish drifted in their familiar arcs, the soft illumination creating a dreamlike landscape that seemed both eternal and fragile. He knelt among them, feeling their pulses echo against his own, and realized that his journey had become one of reflection as much as action. Influence was no longer about shaping others in visible ways, but about holding space, bearing witness, and offering presence. The world, he understood, responded not to the loud or dramatic, but to the patient, attentive heart willing to see and honor life as it existed. That night, the dream unfolded in its full, infinite expanse. The jellyfish glowed in intricate patterns across the endless field, their pulses forming a rhythm that mirrored SpongeBob's own heartbeat. The hidden cove reflected light and possibility, its depths alive with dark, deliberate shadows moving in slow, guiding motions. He felt a profound sense of completeness, not a finality but a soft continuation. His journey of quiet influence had matured, leaving ripples of understanding, compassion, and connection in the lives of those he touched. The dream carried a soft reassurance, whispering that even the smallest attentions, offered freely, could echo across time and space in ways that mattered. In the mornings that followed, SpongeBob moved with the calm assurance of someone who understood the gentle power of presence. He lingered with hesitant customers, offered quiet encouragement to Squidward, and acknowledged Mr. Krabs' careful attention with unobtrusive appreciation. Each act was no longer a conscious effort but a natural extension of the harmony he had cultivated within himself. Laughter and joy continued to ripple outward, not as instruments of spectacle but as reflections of quiet resonance and shared understanding. By the week's end, the subtle currents SpongeBob had nurtured had touched every corner of his world. Children approached with ease, Squidward played with reflective calm, Patrick seemed more attuned to the rhythms around him, and Mr. Krabs noticed beauty beyond his coin. SpongeBob recognized the quiet legacy of these interactions, not in accolades or recognition, but in the soft, persistent shaping of lives, of emotional landscapes, and of the subtle currents that connect all things. That night, SpongeBob drifted into the final dream of the cycle. The glowing jellyfish stretched infinitely, forming delicate, interwoven patterns, and the hidden cove reflected the depth of the harmony he had cultivated. Shadows moved beneath the surface, deliberate and guiding, carrying a message that required no words, that the quiet attentiveness, the patient care, and the subtle influence he offered were enough. The world, in its quiet expanses, responded to presence. And SpongeBob, lying in the soft darkness, felt the satisfaction of having become a gentle, shaping presence within it, a quiet hero of currents, glows, and attentions. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well.
Everything's gonna be okay, man.